And we keep going. Here we're looking at, in this video 7.2, we're looking at joints and movement. We'll actually deal more with the movement side a little bit later, but we'll be referencing some movement a lot in this video. So in this one, we'll be looking at what's a joint, structural and functional classifications of joints, looking in particular and in some detail at the synovial joint, and then why are the synovial joints particularly common in the appendicular skeleton? That's our goals for this video. So when I say joint, I'm not sure what you're thinking about when I say that. You may be thinking about burger joints or other kinds of joints. What I'm talking about are articulations, places where bones meet bones or where bones meet cartilage. So when we say the term joint, we're really talking about an articulation, a place where things come together. Joints are an extremely important part of the skeleton. They allow the skeleton to, for example, move. And we'll see a trade-off between how strong a joint is and how much movement it allows, understanding that the joints, as you'll see, represent the weakest part of the skeleton. But we'll look at that concept here in just a moment. Let me move me out of the way. Okay, having some difficulties here. Get rid of me. Here we go. Okay, so when we talk about the classification of joints, we can talk about them in either a structural class or a functional class. So for structural class, we're talking about what kind of tissue actually makes up that joint. So we can look at three different types: a fibrous joint, a cartilaginous joint, and a synovial joint. We can also look at the functional classifications as well. As you'll see, there'll be a relationship between them. But the functional classes are based on how much motion or movement are allowed at that particular joint. So a joint that's synarthrotic is a non-movable joint. Amphiarthrotic means it's slightly movable, and diarthrotic means it's freely movable. And you'll see in that group, because there's different kinds of movements that are allowed based upon the organization of that joint, you might see some classifications like pivot, ball and socket, etc. So we're going to look at mainly from the structural classification, but we'll make reference to the functional ones as well. Just keep in mind synarthrotic, non-movable; amphiarthrotic, slightly movable; and diarthrotic is freely movable. So let's start with the fibrous and the cartilaginous joints first. The fibrous joints are where bones are going to be joined by dense connective tissue. There's not going to be a joint cavity. And whenever I use that term joint cavity, think little room or little space. There's not going to be one in fibrous joints. Movement is very little to none, so we would describe these as either synarthrotic or amphiarthrotic. And you see examples here of sutures, syndemoses, and gomphoses. I know we get to some interesting names here. And what you see on the screen here are a couple of examples. You've already seen the sutures of a skull, so we won't go back to review those too much. But we recall that there's fibrous connections between the skull bones. Areas where those are not joined are called fontanelles, and eventually the sutures are going to form between or will knit together the bones and therefore allow no movement between them. And as we said, there'll be a delay in some of those sutures forming as the bones grow. The reason that the bones are not fused when we are born is the bones actually, as not being fused, allow some flexibility during childbirth. Syndemoses, like you see down here, here is the radial ulnar syndesmosis. This actually is going to be a place where we have this dense connective tissue that's holding together these two bones. You also see this term interosseous membrane. But the bones here are held further apart than they are in sutures, and that's why it has a different classification. The gomphoses, the only example of that in the body are the teeth and the mandible. This idea of gomphoses actually means peg in a socket. We think about our teeth as being pegs, and they're held in the sockets. by these periodontal ligaments. These ligaments you see here hold the tooth in the sockets. The gingiva, the gum, is going to be protecting the alveolar processes where, well, hard to show here, where the actual tooth fits into that socket. These periodontal ligaments are going to hold the alveolar processes to the alveolar bone. In other words, we have a peg, the tooth, in a socket. Gingivitis is going to be the inflammation of the gums caused by bacterial inflammation. This can spread to the tooth socket and cause periodontal disease. The leading cause of tooth loss in the United States is basically related to inflammation of the gums. Inflammation gradually is going to destroy these periodontal ligaments, and it will lead to tooth loss. Why do we care about that? There's an association between periodontal disease and a number of other chronic inflammatory diseases such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's. So, tooth or oral health is going to be really important in reducing inflammation in other parts of the body. So those are fibrous joints, and again, synarthrotic or amphiarthrotic rather, little to no movement. The cartilaginous joints are where, surprisingly, bones are joined by cartilage. Also, there is no joint cavity. There's no special room or space that we associate with these. The bones are joined by a cartilaginous partition, if you will. And the examples here are symphyses and synchondroses. You see here in the box the pubic symphysis. This is going to be an example of a cartilaginous joint. Each end is just too small to see it, but each end is going to have its own cartilage on the side, and then there's going to be fibrocartilage in the middle, and that therefore makes this a cartilaginous joint. An example of the synchondroses, we should recognize the chond here being cartilage. We talk about the growth plates. Here's an epiphyseal plate of a long bone. This is actually a synchondrosis. This actually represents cartilage that's a joint between two parts of bone. Oops, sorry. And the last group is our synovial joints. Synovial joints are special because they're going to contain a joint cavity. So this is the first one that contains a joint cavity, and we're going to see a specialized organization that will include synovial fluid. Most of the joints that unite bones on the appendicular skeleton are going to be synovial joints. Why? Well, it really comes down to this. Synovial joints are going to allow greater mobility. They're going to allow greater flexibility and allow movement at joints to occur in different directions. If you think about the axial skeleton, it's really not about movement very much. It's about protecting and supporting. The appendicular skeleton is really about movement and manipulation. So we're going to see more of these synovial joints. So hopefully you see the pattern. The tighter the joint is held together, the less movement that's allowed. That kind of makes sense. So going back to our fibrous joints, those are going to be, again, synarthrotic, held together very tightly, as in sutures as an example. No movement's really going to be allowed. All the way to synovial joints, which are going to be not fibrous. They're going to be spaces around the ends of joints, ends of bones, and we'll see that in a second, and they're going to be diarthrotic. Okay, so let's have a look. So, if we're talking about a synovial joint, there's going to be particular features that have to be in a synovial joint to make it a synovial joint. So let's look at the distinguishing features. One is articular cartilage. The bones of either end of this joint, and you see it here, are going to have articular cartilage. There's going to be hyaline cartilage that covers the ends, and it does help absorb some force or pressure in this joint. There's also going to be the joint cavity, and it's a little hard to see it here because of the color, but there's going to be essentially, this is going to be a room or a space. Here is where you can see it the best, where you see kind of the space in here. This is the joint cavity, and it contains fluid, and we'll get to that fluid in a second. Oops, I forgot I had to do this. Hang on one second. There you go. So the joint cavity does contain synovial fluid, and when we say a potential space, that means it's a real space there within the joint. There will be an articular capsule that helps make up that joint cavity, and you can see it here. We have a synovial membrane and a fibrous capsule. Let's work our way from superficial to deep. There's going to be a capsule here made of dense irregular connective tissue that strengthens the joint. If you want to think of it sort of like brick outside of a house. On the inside of that brick, there's going to be sheetrock. There's going to be an inner layer. In this case, it's the synovial membrane it's made of loose connective tissue that lines that synovial membrane, that synovial joint, and it covers the internal surfaces. And its main function is to actually produce the synovial fluid, which we'll get to in a second. So other parts, let's get to that fluid. The synovial fluid is this viscous, or similarly viscous to raw egg. And in fact, when we say the term synovial, the ovial part refers to the egg. There is this fluid in there similar to raw egg white. You know what that looks like, that consistency. And this actually is formed from the filtrate of the blood. Capillaries will enter the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane makes this synovial fluid, and it's like grease or lubrication inside of the joint. It helps to lubricate it, helps to nourish it, helps to protect it. And it contains the glycoprotein molecules secreted by fibroblasts. So again, it's not just water. It's going to be a glycoprotein, semi-viscous, watery, protective solution that helps to lubricate and protect the joint. There will also be some nerves, and you see one of them over here. Let me grab you see a nerve here as well as blood vessels entering. The nerves are going to be important for proprioception. Proprioception is a term which describes the body's or the brain's ability to perceive the body's position. So if you are walking and shifting your weight from one leg to the next, the brain has ability to propriocept, which is to detect the position of joints based upon their movement and degree of deflection, degree of bend, and it helps you keep your balance. Okay. And there's also some reinforcing ligaments. There's none really shown on this one, but you'll find some other related structures here too. There's tendons. Tendons are going to be connecting muscle to the bone, but there may be ligaments that actually appear inside the joint cavity, or they may be on the outside. Okay. So just a few other features to wrap up here. Let me come back. Certain synovial joints have articular discs or a meniscus. They have some other features in here, and we'll look at some specific examples of joints a little bit later. We'll talk about the shoulder and the hip and the elbow, for example. But you may find that certain joints are going to have these, you see here, articular discs. This is basically a pad of protective connective material that helps prevent the bones from rubbing on each other. You see here it occurs in the temporomandibular joint and at the knee joint. And it occurs in joints where the bones have somewhat different shapes. If you get a chance, look at the skeleton and look at the femur and look at the tibia. The femur is round on its distal surface and the tibia is flat on its proximal surface. They really have different shapes. Well, there will also be some menisci in that joint to help basically make the tibia a nice round articulation with the femur. Okay, and let me slide over here. And as we wrap up, A few other features you may find in certain synovial joints, you may find some friction reducing structures. Depending on how that joint moves, it may need to have some reinforcing structures like bursa and tendon sheaths. The bursa and tendon sheaths are both sort of closed bags of lubricants. And just to point out some for you here, here is a subacromial bursa in the shoulder. You notice it's got this sort of green outer part, and it has this white inner layer. You can see a little better over here. Inside of this bursa is actually synovial fluid, and we have a synovial membrane that's producing it. But by having that bag of synovial fluid there, it provides some extra cushion so we don't get the bone rubbing necessarily on this ligament. So bursa do that. And you'll find bursa in certain locations. And again, they're flattened fibrous sacs. You also can find tendon sheaths, which are elongated bursa, if you will. Here is the tendon of the biceps brachii muscle, and notice it's sort of wrapped in this tendon sheath, kind of like a hot dog inside of a hot dog bun. Does the same thing as the bursa. It provides that friction reducing layer so that when that tendon moves, it doesn't rub on anything and cause any pain. As I said, we'll look in future videos here at some specific joints. We'll look at the shoulder and the knee and the elbow in particular, and we'll be able to find some of these same parts. So really be familiar with synovial joints. Hint, hint. You need to know these pretty well. So if you need to, go back and watch that part again. But you should know the major features of a synovial joint in particular, and be reminded that they are diarthrotic. They allow a lot of movement. Because they allow a lot of movement, they're not always going to be very stable. And we'll talk about dislocations a little bit later as well. So that's going to do it for video 7.2.